Okay, for Arvind Panagariya, India too has been a poster child of prosperity in the past decade and a source of much pride to its people. But now it too seems to have slowed down. But to a greater extent than other emerging markets, India's problems seem rooted in corrupt and incompetent government. What are the prospects for honest and effective government in India in the medium future?
Okay. Thank you, David. Glad to be here. I'm perhaps a little less pessimistic than Guillermo is, less pessimistic on India than Guillermo is on Latin America, and I'll come to that. Although currently the news has not been great, as David has just mentioned. One of the reasons I feel actually why India, at least in this round, is different than perhaps Latin America. It's not in terms of trade story here. India also, I think, in terms of the financial flows, etc., has been run reasonably well, actually. So if you go back to the Lehman crisis in 2008, it recovered very quickly and with very little damage. The growth rate for that particular year declined only to 6.7% from maybe somewhere between 8 and 9%. So it really absorbed that shock with great dexterity. And then it recovered, actually, the following year it grew 8%. After that it grew close to 9%. And then the slide downward began to happen. In this respect, I think, this was not, at least India's story is not external. To me, it is a man-made, or depending on your viewpoint, it's a woman-made crisis. As the Prime Minister is a man, but the president of the party in power is a woman, and this is where I meant by man-made versus woman-made. So the growth rate actually declined from its peak quarterly growth rate of about 9.4% in the first quarter of 2010 to now the second quarter of 2013, which is the last quarter for which we have the numbers, 4.4%. That's a 5 percentage points decline on year-on-year growth. What accounts for it? Why did this happen? Well, there is a long-run issue here, which I'll put down, and I want to come to it towards the end, which is that the number of reforms that had to be done. So till 2004, there was a reformist government in place, and huge amounts of reforms got done in almost every area except perhaps higher education and labor markets. And that certainly was the trigger for growth ultimately. And starting from about 2003 to 2012, if you take the average growth rate, was about 8%, in spite of the last 2 years being relatively slower growth rates. But those reforms practically stopped. Infrastructure in particular, the government could not keep up, and about almost 9 to 10 years of 8% growth does begin to push your infrastructure needs to the hilt if you don't keep up with it. There's one factor. The second factor was there was a period of about a year and a few months when this central bank consecutively kept raising the interest rate for 13 consecutive times, and he's trying to fight inflation, but at the same time, I think in the end, he went too far in my view, and certainly continued this journey for too long, and that's had a detrimental effect on the private investment. Then I think one of the biggest worries and biggest factor, I think this is really the biggest factor, which is that paralysis in the government. There are two aspects of this paralysis. One is that starting almost in 2009, there was a hyperactive, very activist environment minister in place. So he stopped basically giving clearances to almost any projects. And that obviously had a hugely detrimental effect on investments. On top of that, there was a series of corruption scandals, as David kind of was mentioning, which sent out about a few of the cabinet members and the top bureaucrats to jail. These cases are still going on, but nevertheless, the very fact that a few ministers and a few top bureaucrats actually ended up in jail, that led everybody at the top to prudentially kind of stop clearing the projects in almost all ministries. So what was initially true only of the environment ministry, and so the environmental clearances got generalized. In effect, particularly for the bureaucrat, the safest thing was to, well, these are my last 2 or 3 years, I'm going to retire. If I take a decision, there is always a risk that I'll be charged that I took money and took the decision. But if I don't take the decision, there can't be any such allegation against me. So it's very safe not to give clearances. And that has really actually led to huge accumulation of the backlog of uncleared projects. And when the finance minister goes out asking, entrepreneurs, why are you, or corporations, why are you not investing more? And the immediate answer is that, well, when I get the 2 projects that are already in the pipeline cleared, then I'll go to the third. So that, I think, has been the biggest factor in the slowdown of growth in India. And right now, I think at least in the very short run, I can't be optimistic because election is going to come out in 2014 May. So it's in the next 6 or 7 months, nothing very big is going to change. Optimism has to come from, the possibility that 2014 will bring a change of the leadership at the top, which will unfreeze this process, which will kind of, this paralysis, put an end to this paralysis. That is, so in my optimism, that is the if. But if that actually does happen, and certainly there are good signs. There is an opposition party candidate who is making big waves, and certainly he is the chief minister of a state, and he certainly looks very pro-reform, has been very open, has been welcoming foreign investors, domestic investors, everybody with open arms in his state, and his state has been doing very well, growing about 10% over the last about almost 11 or 12 years, and even during the slowdown perhaps has slowed down far less. So that is part of the reason for optimism, that if that change is possible, it cannot be ruled out. But otherwise, there are a few other factors which keep me very optimistic about India. First of all, savings rate is over 30% right now. At peak, it was 37%, but it still is holding up at 30%. Demographically, India is very young, so labor shortages are not going to happen. Its entrepreneurial class is first rate, so that they have shown in the last 10 years. All the reforms that did happen, although no progress has happened in the last 10 years, are still in place. So it's an open economy, both domestically as well as in terms of external markets. So you've got to compete against the best in the world. So it is a competitive economy in this sense. And it is still a very poor economy, so it still is very far away from the global technology frontier. So there's a lot of catch-up to do. I mean, China has done a lot of its catch-up, but India still has to do. So subject to the caveat that there is a change in 2014 politically that unfreezes the current paralysis, I think India will actually return to the normal 8-9% growth. And my own predictions are that in the next 15 years, we'll see India emerge as probably the third largest economy in the world. So I'll stop there.
Okay.